Welcome back to meeting number 21 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today, we will continue the discussion which first commenced on Monday, May 16th, 2022. As always, interpretation is available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. And for members participating in person, keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Before speaking, please do wait until I recognize you by name. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. Once again, a reminder that all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. Now, just to provide everyone an update on the speaking list as it currently stands, we now have Mr. Genis, Mr. Abeltaif, Madam Fry, Mr. Perkins, Mr. Genis, and Mr. Zuberi. Mr. Genis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to see colleagues back here on Monday morning, and in anticipation of maybe getting a signal, but I'll proceed with making some arguments here in the as that process continues. And I know that we're currently debating a sub-amendment that was put forward by Mr. Bergeron to an amendment that I had originally put forward. And the purpose of the amendment was to establish some general parameters around the timing that governs the way that this prospective study would proceed. Recognizing that the committee does have greater priorities in front of it, those priorities being, greater priorities, perhaps certainly issues that are ongoing, that we're in the middle of studying, the situation in Ukraine, the dynamics around vaccine equity, as well as the situation and prospective security threats to Taiwan. The amendment was designed to respond to, I think, what was it was not the way the committee normally should operate, which is in the middle of existing studies, a proposal being put forward to say no, we should ignore what we're doing now, and instead we want to raise this political issue, and we said, okay, let's at least have some timelines in place around that, and then also prescribe the way that the subcommittee should be engaged with that process, that the subcommittee on agenda and procedure should meet. And I do want to share that certainly we're hoping for some kind of constructive engagement to come to an understanding on an amendment to this motion that would make it work for the committee. Committees, I think, are at their best when they're able to work on a consensus basis. And certainly from our side, there is a desire to come to an understanding and to meet partway on certain aspects of this. But there, and I think one of the proposals that I've mused about is saying, would we set a timeline on the subcommittee reporting back to the main committee as a mechanism of ensuring that process would move forward in a reasonable fashion. So this is the general objective of the amendment. The sub-amendment, I appreciate it as a sort of as a constructive proposal and as something that maybe provides some basis for some dialogue in terms of how do we come to a consensus as a committee, and when you do have motion from one party, amendment from another party, sub-amendment from another party, I think that can seem unwieldy, but it actually, I think, is potentially very constructive that you have different different parties kind of playing a role in trying to flesh out the appropriate wording around a motion, and that's what kind of brings us to the sub-amendment that we have, which removes the words "after the completion of the committee's studies on," and replaces them with the words "the committee make a decision on the studies before it on." And there's a part 2 to the sub-amendment, which I'll speak to in a moment. But the the initial section here is substantive in the change that it proposes to make. That is, that the existing amendment prescribes a path forward that involves the committee needing to complete particular studies, Ukraine, vaccine equity, and Taiwan. The revised version prescribes not that those studies be completed, but that a decision be made on those studies, and again, none of this is sort of impossible to kind of go back and forth on and try to establish a constructive way forward. But I do think that at least some of these existing studies, it would be very important to say we should not just make a decision on them, but actually complete them. We've done a lot of work in terms of hearings on the issue of vaccine equity, and I think it's evident that the dynamics around vaccine equity are constantly changing. There are some similar issues that are consistent over time, but when I think that we initially talked about undertaking this work, there was questions about there being enough vaccines, and we kind of realized as the study went forward that there were issues around delivery. That delivery was a big issue, and so it's worthwhile, I think, seeking to complete that work. And in the spirit of wanting to complete that work, of course, that's why we have at many points sought to adjourn the debate on this motion so that we could get back to that work. And members of other parties have accused us of sort of dragging this out, but I think that accusation is hard to square with the reality that we are the ones saying, let's adjourn the debate on this issue so that we can hash out the dynamics of our agenda going forward, but really be able to focus on completing the work that's before the committee right now. So creating a little bit more space for conversation around the path forward, but in the meantime, adjourning debate and not in a final way, of course, as members know or should know, the procedure around an adjournment of debate isn't to make an issue disappear. Something can be brought back very shortly after something's been adjourned, but it does create the space for some of that dialogue to happen. And look, insofar as we have informally at least had quasi-adjournments of debate, we had an in-camera opportunity to hear from certain witnesses, for example, that these are things that we've been willing to do in some cases, but not others. And this is in particular, as I was speaking to the issue of vaccine equity, the completion of that, not just the making of a decision about, but the completion of it is something that I think would have been worthwhile and would be worthwhile to do as soon as reasonably possible. On the issue of Ukraine as well, the completion of our work on Ukraine, or at least the completion of sort of the immediate phase of that work. And again, this is where I think we could kind of wordsmith in between. I don't think the procedures allow for sub amendments. I think you just do those as subsequent sub amendments. But the fact that the committee should complete I would think an initial report, an initial statement, ideally an initial report that puts forward the committee's work up till now on that particular issue, I think would be very, very worthwhile. And look, if the committee makes a decision to defer to another committee or set aside a study, obviously the work on Taiwan is important, but the work on Taiwan began before the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations began. And look, I mean, I think there would be an argument for continuing that work at either this committee or that committee. On the one hand, this committee has begun that work, and there are many other issues at the other committee. But on the other hand, the other committee is there to specifically look at some of the issues around, among other things, aggressive action by the Chinese state, and this is where that and that work might fit well within that framework at that committee. So this is where I think the issue of completion, as opposed to making a decision about that work, is important, but that completion could ostensibly take different forms. I do think it's important to raise that the language of the sub-amendment does introduce some ambiguity where it maybe doesn't exist in the original version. The amendment uses the language of make a decision on. Excuse me, I think I've been saying make a decision about, but it's make a decision on. And it does not necessarily specify that that decision would be carried out prior to proceeding to the next phase of it. So I think that's an area of ambiguity that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of the vote around this. So, for example, if we were to make a decision about the Ukraine study, let's say we made a decision that, in fact, we wanted, in the case of the Ukraine study, to complete that study or to complete an initial report before moving to this other prospective study. That would be making a decision about the matter, but it wouldn't necessarily be making a decision about and carrying out that decision. Carrying out that decision would be to actually make the decision to complete the report in this sort of hypothetical instance, and then carrying out that decision would be to make the decision to complete the report, and then to actually complete the report. This is a different matter than just making the decision. So I would worry, insofar as there is that ambiguity in the language around this, that were we to make a decision about it, let's say we make a decision, okay, we're gonna complete the vaccine equity report hypothetically, then that would satisfy the conditions of this motion, and then we would proceed on to this other study that's envisioned by the original motion, without actually carrying out the work that's prescribed by that decision, that is the completion of the report. So the making of a decision on is conceptually distinct from sort of the question of making a decision and carrying out that decision on the same point. So this is where I think we need to have a greater degree of clarity around it. I would certainly accept that in terms of the path forward on these three studies that are currently before the committee, Ukraine, vaccine equity, and Taiwan, that we might want to make decisions about those studies. I would suggest that the completion language is stronger, but we might want to make decisions and carry out those decisions about those studies. Say we're going to complete two of them and transfer one of them, or complete one, do an interim report on one, and then continue it concurrently while we set aside one. These are the kinds of decisions that the committee might make on how to proceed with those studies. And I think that is, sort of broadly speaking, the process that was envisioned in the development of this sub-amendment. And I think it's not an unreasonable prescription to say that we would want to leave ourselves some degree of flexibility there. It's just that the existing kind of structure is not, I think. Pardon me. The existing text of the sub-amendment is not quite explicit in terms of how we would want that to unfold in terms of the making and carrying out of decisions before proceeding on to the subsequent matter that would be then before the committee. The second part of the sub-amendment makes some further changes that are noteworthy. The previous language there was prescribing the manner in which the study is to proceed, and it replaces that with specifying the manner in which the studies be undertaken. So again, replacing prescribing the manner in which the study is to proceed with specifying the manner in which the studies be undertaken. So I think the most substantive part of that change, there's a few cases where the words are changed, and I think we do need to kind of note what's implied by the change in those words. But there are a couple places where, but I think the biggest, the most substantive, part of that change is the shift from the language of study to studies. So the original amendment envisioned that the study would proceed after a subcommittee report was adopted, which described how the study on originally envisioned by Dr. Fry's motion would proceed. I think the meaning is then shifted by the sub-amendment to say that the subcommittee should meet and prescribe the manner in which all of the committee's work would proceed, looking at this new motion as well as the proposals around Ukraine, vaccine equity, Taiwan, and I think I don't think that's a bad thing. Actually, I think that the shift from study to studies is probably constructive, because it kind of really what it does is it invites us to say the subcommittee should get together, should talk about what the foregoing agenda is going to be, and should come to some kind of agreement on how to proceed with respect to all of the studies. And this is, I think, how this should have proceeded all along. The reason we are in this situation of hashing out agenda at the main committee is because a member decided to bring it to the main committee in the middle of other studies instead of doing that work at the subcommittee, which is the normal process. And I don't, of course, dispute the right of members to do that, but it's, I think, just not the most effective way.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. Point d'ordre.
Point of order. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm new in this committee, so I don't know in what manner you function normally, but I'm hearing the arguments of my colleague on the sub-amendment. So I'm wondering if we can vote at this point on the sub-amendment proposed by Bloc Québécois to come back to the amendment. Would you like me to repeat that? He didn't have his...
To confer with the clerk, given that we currently do have a speaking list, we cannot vote on it.
Can you add me to the speaking list, please? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry I didn't have my earpiece in for the entire time of that, and my French is not always best on Monday after a red-eye flight, but I think I got the gist of it, and so I'll just proceed for a couple more minutes. I'm not going to. I don't have that much more to say other than just to wrap up some of these thoughts around some of the distinction that's envisioned by the amendment, by the sub-amendment, trying to understand it and respond to the issues that it raises. So, just with respect to the issue of part two of the sub-amendment, the difference between study and studies, saying that this part of the sub-amendment I view as being constructive in the sense that it directs our attention towards the subcommittee to prescribe the manner in which the foregoing work or the studies of the committee would proceed, and then we can kind of go from there. I think this is why the very first time this was discussed, within the first hour of this being discussed, I know we had put forward a motion to just refer the entire matter to the subcommittee. And again, we could have done it. It would have made much more sense to have the subcommittee define an agenda going forward. Instead, a situation was created because other members of the committee insisted, no, we can't adjourn the meeting, we can't adjourn debate, we can't do anything else until this matter is dealt with, which I don't think made sense, and I think kind of created a situation which is not really consistent with the professed desire of any members of the committee, and yet we continue to move forward with some of these other proposals, and they continue to not proceed. So I think that's important. But the idea envisioned through the sub-amendment of a subcommittee process moving forward is, I think, again, worthwhile. In terms of some of the word substitution that the sub-amendment involves, it effectively replaces the word prescribing with specifying. I looked the words up to get sort of specific clarity around just trying to understand what the difference was, because sometimes you have a sub-amendment or an amendment and that changes words, and you wonder, is something different being meant by those words? And look, clearly this is an important committee. It's important to make sure that the words we're using are precise, or at least that when we are adopting measures with respect to particular wording, that we understand what the wording is and what the meaning of those words are. So the word being removed, prescribing, means to lay down in writing or otherwise as a rule or a course of action to be followed, appoint, ordain, or enjoin. I got these from dictionary.com, which I don't know. It's Mr. Oliphant probably has opinions on whether that's the optimal linguistic source or not, but that's the one I used this morning. And that's proposed to replace it with specifying, which is to mention or name specifically or definitely, to state in detail. So in this sense, I'm not sure why the preference was made for the word specifying as opposed to prescribing. Prescribing seems more appropriate in that it's more definitive to the practice of a committee to lay down, to say this is what we're going to do. Specify has the nature of kind of explaining in more detail, but not defining. So although it's not a hill to die on, I do think the word prescribing is more precise in the original formulation as opposed to the word that was put forward in the amendment. And then also in the second part of the amendment, it is replacing the word proceed with undertake. Proceed being to move or go forward or onward, especially after stopping, and then to undertake, to take upon oneself as a task, performance. So again, I'm not. It does seem to me, looking at the change in language there from proceed to undertake, that both words could be appropriate. At least the implication that proceed means after stopping might be appropriate, especially given I think the challenges we've had. But really, either way, proceed or undertake. So I guess in general, I'm trying to sort through the sub-amendment and say, are there some things that make sense? Yes. Are there some things where words are being substituted where it's not entirely clear to me why? Sure. Are there other issues that are raised in terms of changing this? I think the biggest substantive difference is this question of make a decision on versus completion of studies. And we've made the case precisely because of the importance of the work we're doing and what constitutes sort of just good operating procedures for a committee to be able to finish one thing, go to another, or at least finish kind of a package of things before going to another. I would make the case that what we're doing, that the idea of finishing or at least making a definitive decision and carrying out that decision with respect to the existing work of the committee is a better way for us to proceed than simply making a decision about. And look, I hope I've suggested in this intervention that we are looking to to work collaboratively to establish a path forward here. We believe that committees have a mandate to try to work in a consensus way to whatever extent possible, and that there's a need for us to do that. There's a value for us doing that, instead of people just dropping in and saying, well, we want to upend the committee's agenda and do something different because there's a political imperative that's pushing us to do so. We want to get back to the work of studying the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine. We want to get back to completing the committee's work on vaccine equity, completing the work on Taiwan, as well as proceeding with the legislation. That's what we've said all along. That's why we've moved motions to proceed to other matters. That's why we've moved motions to adjourn debate. And it's just, at the end of the day, pretty rich for folks to say, well, we want the committee to get to other things too, but then to vote against those motions that are precisely about doing that say this is what we're gonna do now. So, Mr. Chair, in the spirit of that, I will move that the committee proceed to consideration of next steps on the study on Ukraine.
So we have a new sub-amendment?
No, it's a vote.
It's about, okay. So, but do we not have the wording of the sub-amendment? Just. Mr. Generous, if before we take the vote, if for the benefit of all members, you could read out the revised sub-amendment one more time, I think that would be helpful.
Sorry, it's not a sub-amendment.
It's a motion.
I moved a motion. A motion that we proceed to discussion of next steps on the study on Ukraine.
Okay, absolutely. Is there unanimous consent for that? Nope, I'm afraid not. So we next go to.
Sorry, it's a dilatory motion, Mr. Chair.
Yes,
There's a vote.
what's that? My apologies. Yes, so we'll call a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bandayan.
No.
Dr. Fry.
Nope.
Mr. Oliphant. No. Mr. Sarai.
Nope.
Mr. Zuberi.
No.
Mr. Abeltaif.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
Yes.
Mr. Genuis.
Yes.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes.
Madame Michaud.
Contre.
Ms. McPherson.
No.
Mr. Chair, that is 7 nays and 4 yeas.
Thank you. So we now go next to Mr. Abeltaif.
I would like to offer my time slot to our colleague from the Bloc Québécois.
You would like to, sorry?
Yeah, I'd like to offer my time slot to the member from the Bloc Québécois.
Madame Michaud, the floor is yours.
Ben, merci. C'est très...
Thank you. It's very kind of you. Well, I would have used my time to ask again for a vote on the sub-amendment proposed by my colleague, Stéphane. But I know that that can't be done because there's still a list of speakers, of course, and I've heard the arguments from my colleague, and I welcome his attachment to this sub-amendment. I did not know that it was possible to talk for about 5 minutes about changing a word from singular to plural. But for the benefit of those who are listening to us, I was trying to explain to colleagues and to family members, I was trying to explain what filibustering meant, and they were not really understanding. But had I told them to tune in to today's committee, I think they would have understood. So I think we can go ahead and proceed with the discussion on the amendment proposed by Madam Fry. And when I read the studies that have been taking place in this committee, I think it's very interesting work. So it's a shame that this committee is still at this point talking about this motion. I will not take up more time. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague who graciously gave me his time.
We next go to Dr. Fry.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to speak to the sub-amendment, but I wanted to speak to the whole concept that my motion originally was trying to supersede other motions. And if you read my motion, it isn't. It is proposing a study. Why would I want to bump Ukraine, especially when, with regard to the study I'm proposing, we heard from the ambassador designate from Ukraine that Russian women are being raped by, Ukrainian women are being raped by Russian soldiers regularly. These are the kinds of women who need access to safe and legal abortion. These are the kind of women who need the services we're talking about to see if they have gotten any sexually transmitted diseases from the Russian soldiers. These are the women that we want to talk about. And they are fleeing as refugees to countries, two of which do not actually allow safe legal abortion. So we're talking about Ukraine, actually, but I'm still wanting to make the point, Mr. Chair, that I am not trying to supersede anything. Ukraine is a dire emergency. Vaccines, we have not done with COVID, or at least COVID has not done with us. If we look at the B4 and the B5 strains that are now happening around the world. So yes, vaccine equity is very, very important. So these two are really important things. No one is trying to supersede anything here. I would just like to note that I brought forward a motion very, very similar to this in December. I don't know what happened to it. I'm on the subcommittee. And once again, a motion on sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls around the world, which worsened the need for those services, were worsened during COVID. I don't know what happened to it. It was still bumped. So I just need to say that I hope we don't keep bumping this motion constantly because it is as urgent. Women are actually dying. And I just want to read to you here that 2 million women were hospitalized in this year alone because of unsafe abortions. 60% of pregnancies end in abortion, and 45% of those are unsafe. And complications in pregnancy and childbirth are the leading cause of death between girls or young women between the ages of 15 and 19 in 2020. So this has been going on for a long, long time and exacerbated by COVID, and has been exacerbated by Ukrainian war, and has been exacerbated by conflicts around the world, especially where rape has become a weapon of war and no longer a casualty of war. So these are some of the things that I want to talk about. These are important issues. Women are dying. Their lives can be spared if we made this an important issue to study, not have priority over Ukraine, not have priority over vaccine equity. I'm not suggesting that at all. But somehow this committee is going to have to study this issue that's been bouncing around since December of 2021. I just don't understand why it is not important. I just don't understand it. I mean, when you think of the number of women in the African region and the women in the Americas, where the rates of maternal mortality, gender-based violence, adolescent pregnancy, and poverty are rising, this has got to be important for people. The fact that hundreds of thousands of women are dying in pregnancy and childbirth. We have hundreds of thousands of women dying because they don't have access to safe legal abortions. These are important issues. Women are dying. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm not preempting anything. I don't want to preempt Ukraine. I don't want to preempt vaccine equity because these are urgent issues. But I do think somewhere along the way, women have got to become urgent issues as well, and their death has got to be meaningful to this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. We next go to Mr. Perkins. Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Fry's comments are interesting, particularly in light of the fact that those are real issues in Ukraine, and obviously it's one of the issues that the committee is able to consider in its ongoing discussion on Ukraine. And the decision to put forward an amendment or a sub-amendment that removes the language, as is before us, it removes the language that says that that study would be considered after the completion of the committee's studies, in itself, from Mr. Bergeron, has the implication, obviously, that somehow this study should begin before those other three studies that are ongoing with the committee are completed. Otherwise, why would you remove the words, and I'll repeat it again, after the completion of the committee's studies? So while I appreciate the intent of what Dr. Fry said, the direction of the motion that's before us actually leaves, in my view, a different impression about what the subcommittee on agenda should be considering and when it should consider the study that is being proposed by Dr. Fry. I would think that given some of the context of what's going on right now in Ukraine, and last week we saw on the day before the German leader, as well as several other leaders, were going to visit with President Zelensky in Ukraine, that Russia cut off the supply to the Northern Stream 1 pipeline the day before. I don't think that was obviously a coincidence. They said it was because they have some parts issues, and shockingly, the only parts that are available for that turbine come from Canada. And so it's an attempt, obviously, to influence what this government is doing and how it approaches the issue of Ukraine and how it approaches the issue of sanctions. I know that speaks to the issue about why are we giving direction to the subcommittee in terms of the priority and importance of various studies that the committee has undertaken. And I think those issues that are ongoing are critically urgent right now. The issues to which Dr. Fry spoke are issues that are ongoing now, and why the Ukraine study needs to continue. The issue of the supply of oil and gas are now. The issue of whether or not the sanctions that Canada has imposed do enough are issues this committee should be looking at now. The issue of whether or not the Canadian government has done enough to mobilize world opinion on sanctions so that the sanctions that have been imposed by countries such as Canada are not being worked around, which they are. The committee has heard testimony that Africa and Latin America are not abiding by the global sanctions and are filling in the space that Western countries have left. Speak to the issue of examining now what's going on with regard to the government's response and whether or not it is actually taking a leadership role in multilateral organizations to put forward more penalties and to get more allies around the world. So I've not ever heard the Minister of Foreign Affairs talk about putting forward motions to get the Organization of American States or other multilateral organizations on board with imposing sanctions to prevent those regions from actually filling in the gap. We even have G7 countries that have gone in and filled in the gap where our trade has stopped. So I think it's incumbent on the committee to get onto the work of studying Ukraine and completing that study right now, not waiting, as this motion implies, that the committee make a decision on the studies before it. On those, that decision was already made. That decision was made by this committee to study that now, I don't know why the subcommittee needs to study it again, since you're in the middle, the committee is in the middle of yet that study and the study on Taiwan and vaccine efficacy. While there is a work plan, as there is for every committee that has, I believe, 17 potential. This Dr. Fry's would be an 18th potential study. The way and the normal flow of committees, as I understand it, is that committees will work through their agenda to the end of the session, which is fast approaching us here, and then would revisit the work plan come the fall and reprioritize the undeveloped or unprioritized studies as part of the agenda as we come back in September. Dr. Fry's motions on notice, it can be considered in the context of all of those other motions that are on notice and that the committee has before it to consider on what it could do next. But having 4 studies ongoing at one time seems excessive and seems like a recipe to try and be all things to all people, yet achieve nothing, never complete a study, never get anywhere, never deal with vaccine efficacy, or never deal with the situation in Taiwan, which is, yes, impacted by what happens in Ukraine and Russia's attitude. Make no mistake, everybody around this table understands that China is watching very closely what goes on in Ukraine and what the West's response is to that, which to date has been gradual, and we've supported it, but I believe needs to be stronger, and that's why we need to look at these issues like the leakiness of the sanctions. I mean, how is the government of Canada going to deal with the issue of the turbine repair on the pipeline? Is it going to allow for an amendment to our existing sanctions against them? And all of a sudden now, well, we've got to provide it in this case, we'll provide an exception, and we'll provide another exception here and another exception there as Moscow and Putin continues to manipulate the West on what they're doing. And this government's been easily manipulated on the issue of Russia, and they are constantly finding themselves in this position because they are viewed in the global community, in our response on this war, as weak. So I would draw the attention to the committee as well that this is a larger issue than just one person at the head of the table in Moscow because of the clampdown on the freedom of speech that's happened in the Soviet Union. Again, another area where the Ukraine study could take a look at, where over 80% of Russians actually seem to support in polling this illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's what happens when you restrict freedom of access to the press. You kick all the foreign press out. And the manipulation that's going on. And so the reason that the sanctions, particularly from democracies, are so important is it allows countries such as Canada, the Western countries, and frankly should be every country in the world as far as I'm concerned, because they could be next, that should be looking at trying to cut off the cash, the flow of money that flows to Russia that allows them to wage this war. It helps to exhaust their financial resources in Russia. We've seen the voluntary things of what's happened with McDonald's or Starbucks, and now some of the oligarchs have come in and basically taken over that real estate in Russia and said, well, I'll just operate McDonald's with a knockoff McDonald's burger. So it's not really that's not having an impact. The government of Canada has imposed, I think it is, individual sanctions on, I think it is about 341 individuals in Russia. Now, people listening may not realize how big Russia is. Russia is a country of 144 million people. So the percentage of people being directly impacted by our sanctions is 0.00000 4%. It's infinitesimal. And unless we get to the point where sanctions are hurting and going beyond just the richest of the rich who have their manners and ways to move their money around and protect their assets, unless we start looking at the tools that the government of Canada is using in this study that's being delayed, that unless we look at those issues to understand why it is and how it is that we can change the minds of the people in Russia, one of the ways, as it is with most people, is to be able to actually see a day-to-day impact in their pocketbook, their access to goods and services. We saw this ultimately with Russia. It's what caused the collapse, one of the things that caused and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I spoke to several meetings ago about the coup in Russia in 1991 when I worked for the foreign minister. The bread lines, people having to line up for bread in Moscow, and the lack of access to goods ultimately drove to the population, as it often does in such situations, rising up against its leadership and changing its form of government. With the 80% support that there appears to be in Russia for Putin's illegal war, I would think that one of the things this committee would want to be urgently studying with its witnesses and giving direction to the subcommittee on the priorities with which these studies should be taken. The 14 other studies, now 15 if this Dr. Fry's motion were to pass, 15 other motions, is to give the subcommittee direction that these things are urgent, that we need to find a way to have more effective global sanctions on Russia, and they need to be broader than 344 people, in my view. That's not having the impact. Obviously, we're in month 4 of a war that was not supposed to last more than a week. But through the resilience and incredible courage of the Ukrainian people, we see a pushback against what was supposedly one of the world's great superpowers, with small little Ukraine's army. So it's quite impressive, and I think that we need to be doing more, and certainly it's not much to ask that this government take a broader and a bigger leadership role in multilateral organizations such as the OAS, even the United Nations. Well, understand about the challenges with the Security Council and Russia having a veto, but that doesn't stop us from standing up. Canada has achieved global sanctions on countries before by looking at the regional organizations, such as the Commonwealth and the Francophonie. If we feel, as we've heard from Ukrainian officials, that Africa is one of the leaky parts of the sanctions, then why is this government not working through the Francophonie and the Commonwealth to impose sanctions, to get those organizations to lead those countries towards a unified global voice for
Point
our
d'ordre, Monsieur le
country?
Président.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to remind maybe my colleague, with all due respect, that the situation in Ukraine has nothing to do with the sub-amendment that we're discussing right now. The sub-amendment is very simple. It is about changing a couple of words and going from study to studies. So I do understand what he's trying to do, but if he can maybe come back to the sub-amendment and hear his arguments on the sub-amendment, and then go through the list of speakers and hopefully vote on the sub-amendment, it would be hugely appreciated. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Michaud.
Thank you, Madam Michaud.
As has become customary in this committee, it is important that members keep their remarks restricted to the issue at hand. In this particular instance, as you're well aware, there is a sub-amendment, so I would ask that your comments relate directly to the sub-amendment, please. Thank you, Mr. Perkins. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Michaud. I think the link, if I can, to what I was saying is the link is related to the words where the words after the completion of the committee studies on, and then the motion goes on to say Ukraine, vaccine equity, and Taiwan, and be replaced with the committee make a decision on the studies before it. And so in order to make and give guidance to the committee and the subcommittee, in order to participate in this debate about whether to support or not support this sub-amendment to this amendment, I think it's important for us to talk about the issue of why it is important to complete the studies, which is what's being proposed to be removed from this motion by the members. Removing the word completion, I don't think that's a small change. I don't think it's a modest change. I don't think it's a grammatical change. It's a major change to the intent of the amendment. The amendment said that the motion, Dr. Fry's motion that's before us, not be done until after the completion of the studies on Ukraine, vaccine equity, and Taiwan. This is a major change to say that the committee make a decision on. And as I was saying, I don't know why the committee needs to make a decision on these studies. It already made that decision on these studies. And that decision was made quite some time ago in order to do these 3 studies. That's why we're in the middle of them. It's highly unusual, in my view, for a committee to say, in the middle of studying 3 studies, that all of a sudden now we're not going to complete those 3 studies. And that what we're going to do is we're going to do a 4th study. I mean, I know we can all walk and chew gum at the same time. I get that. But having 4 studies ongoing just prolongs the ability of the committee to actually finish any of its work. And so 3 studies at one time is actually quite a lot for a study to have ongoing, and particularly on issues as important as the war in Ukraine, particularly as important about what we see going on with Taiwan and the potential for China to take the precedent of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. And vaccine efficacy, a very valuable study. We're all very conscious and want to make sure that parts of the world that have not had the same access to COVID vaccines in order to prevent further death and long-term health problems of people in countries that still haven't had the resources, perhaps like we've had in Canada, to access these vaccines and get well over 80% of our population vaccinated. These are important studies to finish and to provide valuable input to the government in their public policy decision making. So I don't look at this, and I do know that I think what Ms. Michaud was probably referring to was some of Mr. Jennis's comments around the definitions of the word undertaken versus prescribing. And I found that actually fascinating because they do have different meanings. Words have meaning in this place. Every single word means something specific and is changed for a reason. Otherwise, the change wouldn't be proposed in this amendment. Or sub-amendment, I should say. So I would encourage, as part of the relevance of understanding why it is I believe that these studies be completed before we move on to other studies, the other 14, and if Dr. Fry's motion goes through, 15 other studies that presumably the committee will take a look at in the fall. If there is urgency related to women's health issues with what's going on in Ukraine, then that can be managed and discussed in the Ukraine study. I would encourage the committee to make that part of their study, because obviously that's the most critical part of what is happening globally right now in terms of that issue. And so I think the relevance for those who are watching is that there's multifaceted approaches about how the Western countries, and particularly Canada, is approaching how to deal with these issues, and in particular how to deal with the issue of this illegal war. We do have 1.4 million Ukrainians in Canada, and they want to hear and see the witnesses on this. They want to see Ukrainian officials come before this committee and publicly be able to bring us up to date. They want to understand whether or not the actions of this government on Ukraine and its sanctions are actually having any impact whatsoever in terms of bringing the Russian public and the powerful people in Russia to account for this terrible, terrible injustice that they're doing. They'd like to hear, I suppose, from witnesses about what's the end game and what's the alternative to go forward. There's always been a lot of discussion about the restraint that Canada has to have and that the Western countries have to have about Ukraine because of the nuclear weapons of Russia. And I don't believe there's been a real discussion or debate on that, and that's certainly something appropriate for this committee in its priorities of trying to deal with whether or not the Ukraine study should be completed or whether or not it should just be one of another ongoing series of subjects, fourth, fifth, why not add a sixth? There are a lot of good things on the committee's docket to study. I spoke previously about Haiti. I understand that that's a potential area. There's always ongoing issues in Haiti. There are a lot of other things around the world that this committee can be doing. Why not have a sixth and a seventh and an eighth committee study ongoing at the same time? And let's hold a meeting on each of those sort of once every month or 2 months and take a year to go through 8 of them. Meanwhile, thousands of people are dying in Ukraine, and this government is not taking a global leadership role as we have in the past. This country has in the past taken global roles in trying to force the globe, even close friends like the United States, even close friends like Great Britain on the issue of sanctions and apartheid. We've taken the world, led the world, as I explained to members 2 meetings ago, about the role when I was in foreign affairs that we had in leading the world on the sanctions on Haiti. And I seem obsessed, I know, on the issue of sanctions. But outside of military action, this is one of the most important tools that we have in dealing with Ukraine and in particular Russia. And my belief is that those sanctions need to be much broader than just what happened to 344 individuals in a 144 million population country. I would suggest that that's a vital part of looking at and understanding whether or not we're doing our part. There was, by the way, on the weekend in a online news provider in my part of the world in Atlantic, Canada, called the Macdonald Notebook. There was an interesting interview with former Prime Minister Mulroney about the status of things in the Ukraine. And of course, remembering that he is close friends with Mikhail Gorbachev and stays very well informed on all the international issues of the day today. And he was asked the question about whether or not the West should actually pursue military action, and he gave an answer that actually probably would surprise most committee members. He did not take the common view that the West has expressed on military action, which is basically telegraphed. The West has telegraphed that there is a limit to what we're willing to do, and there's a limit there because of the nuclear arsenal of Russia and fear over the escalation of this war if NATO or our partners or a coalition of the willing, you might say, even as was done in the Gulf War, first Gulf War, it was called the Coalition of the Willing, went in and did an action to try and support our friends in the Ukraine. And former Prime Minister Mulroney said he believed that NATO and the Western countries actually should be providing military assistance, on the ground troops and help for Ukraine. And being pushed back on that question on, well, what about, the nuclear arsenal? He said, you know what, no matter what Putin has done, he understands what the consequences of him engaging in a nuclear situation would be. And that consequence would be ruinous for I almost said the Soviet Union. It's hard to break old habits, but Putin is acting like he's the head of the Soviet Union and wants to reassemble it, but that there would be consequences. So he doesn't believe that the issue of the nuclear arsenal should constrain the West. And if you start taking that, that's an area that this committee should be taking a look at. Should this committee be having a serious look at the issue of whether or not the nuclear threat on the war in Ukraine is a real threat? Have we just given away the store on this? Have we given away the store in terms of telegraphing to the Russian regime that we will provide food aid and we will provide a certain amount of armaments, but we're not really willing to get into the fight to help protect Ukraine? To me, that's an important distinction between a decision on a study that's already ongoing, which is kind of confusing to me when the original motion says completion of the study. I don't know why you need to make a decision on, as I've said before, a decision on the studies before it, when if that decision isn't to stop the study that we're already doing. What decision has to be made on the current studies that are ongoing other than to continue them? One would think that's what we have to do. So in speaking to the sub-amendment, I'm speaking to the fact that in order to get to completion, we have a lot of areas that this Ukraine study needs to look at, whether it's sanctions, whether it's food insecurity. Other members have talked in the last meeting about the issue of food insecurity. The UN 2 weeks ago, I believe, said that there's potential this summer to have up to 47 million people starving immediately as a result of the cutoff of Ukrainian grain to the world. I suspect that number is going to grow quite a bit more. So I would think that the committee would want to complete the study in order to look at those issues rather than delay it and add a fourth or a fifth or a sixth study to its agenda. As I've said, I believe that those issues which the committee will determine as a master of its own destiny, as every committee is, that the committee can take a look at those studies themselves and determine in the fall, once Ukraine, once Taiwan, and once vaccine efficacy, which I suspect all of that, if done properly, is going to take a lot of the agenda in the fall. I know that the committee has probably put forward limited number of meetings, but as often happens in committees, once you get into a subject matter and you see the number of witnesses from the public that want to appear on that subject matter, quite often the committees will midway change, not to another issue or add another study, but will change and add more meetings to the agenda because of both the public interest, and when you start opening up an issue, it opens up more and more issues for the committee to study on that particular subject. So quite often I found that committees will actually extend the number of meetings it has partway through a decision. And I can't imagine that on Ukraine, given some of the things that I've said, that on Ukraine that we wouldn't be finding that there would need to be a number of meetings held on the issue of sanctions, that there'd need to be a number of meetings held on food security, that there'd have to be and should be a number of meetings held on the issue of whether or not we have been too dismissive of the issue of providing on-the-ground troop support to our allies in Ukraine on this illegal war. And that's just on the one. And vaccine efficacy, obviously, there are a great many witnesses who will want to hear and talk about the production of those vaccines, where they're being produced, their efficacy throughout the world, and their access throughout the world, and what's happening. I mean, in Canada, we actually took during the height of the pandemic some of the vaccines that were set aside for poorer countries. We actually took them ourselves. Yes, we did replenish them later, but obviously that's an area, if you're studying vaccine efficacy, you should, and access and equity throughout the world. One of the first issues I would want to do is some hearings on the issue of what led us to the position in Canada that we had to take vaccines from poorer countries to do ourselves. What decision-making of this government did it have in leading up to that led to us taking that extreme case? Some of us know, we can assume, that it has to do with the deal that the government initially did with China to bring a Chinese vaccine to Canada as opposed to one produced by the pharmaceutical companies. But I think, obviously, if you're going to talk about vaccine equity, you're going to want to hear witnesses about what led to that, what happened on that. That's going to take some time. And, you know, the complexity of the one China strategy around the world, how it's evolved on Taiwan, the impact of Russia and Ukraine on Taiwan, the change in the leadership in China, which has led to a more aggressive and less democratic approach to foreign affairs by the Chinese government, whether it's, of course, what we're seeing in Hong Kong, which is a prime example, if you're not careful and vigilant, what can happen. You've got essentially a faux democracy there now, and everything run by Beijing. China has never given up its rights, its assumed rights or its claim on rights in the negotiations and in the global world order to Taiwan. That's an important study, and an important study that shouldn't be stopped, as this motion, amendment or sub-amendment, seems to imply. Because when you take the word completion out, by inference, you're saying it's going to stop. And we're going to go on to something else. So I would urge members of the committee and the subcommittee, which will look at this agenda, along with the 14 other, I know I'm not allowed, Mr. Chair, to reference the details of what the committee has before it in future studies. I believe that document is not a public document, and those motions aren't there. But I do know there's a lot of good and legitimate areas that need some urgent consideration too. So the purpose of this debate here is to debate whether or not we should essentially, in my view, when I read it, suspend these existing studies and do other things. And I don't know why. Well, I know a lot of people will view that the motion by Dr. Fry is vitally important, but the most important parts of that can be dealt with within the existing studies that are ongoing in terms of the use of certain tactics in war that are harmful, disgusting, and should be condemned by all that are done in war. And so that's part of the Ukraine study. And I don't know why we would want to suspend the study to go and basically do that study, to bring in another study to look at an area that actually the committee can already look at in its existing study. So I would consider that the subcommittee needs to understand that the priorities there need to be driven by the priorities of what's going on in the world. Everything that's going on in the world, to whomever it's happening to, can seem like the most vital and important thing going on, and that's understandable. If I were in many of the countries, when you see democracy at threat or you see human rights at threat around the world, you see that understandably we want to help. We're Canadians. We've always wanted to help everywhere there's an issue. That's been our great reputation, is we actually go out and do more than speak nice words in organizations. We try and lead those organizations to a better conclusion to help people, whether it's the sovereignty of a democracy or whether it's individual human rights. And those things are what are clearly the most important in terms of the subcommittee's decisions on whether or not these studies need to be committed. I mean, there are war crimes going on in Ukraine. I think that studying those war crimes and giving the government advice from this committee needs to be part of that study as well. I don't know how that could get done in 2 more meetings. There is an anti-Western xenophobia that's been created in Russia through this. That's going to take us a long time to come over and get over with our relationships with Russia. I mean, it can be a confusing country to us sometimes in Canada. I can remember when I was a very, very, very young guy, the 72 Canada-Russia hockey series. And the Soviet Union still to this day, Russia to this day still claims that they won that series. You know why? They think they won it, even though we won 5 games. They believe they won it because they scored more goals. So, you know, you can always make something sound like a winner, even though, you know, ultimately a game of hockey is decided at the end of the 3rd period or overtime by goals. So we're up against a country whose population believes that this is a just war. We do know, though, that the GDP, as progressive sanctions have happened over the last number of years in Russia on a number of things, and that the GDP per capita in Russia has declined as a result of those. And these are just playing at the edges sort of sanctions. They're not dealing directly with the main issue. My understanding is that the GDP capita per capita in Russia in 2013 was about $16,000 US, and now it's down about 40% to $10,000 GDP annual income for every Russian. So clearly, what the West has been doing through a series of issues that started with their illegal invasion of the Donbass region during the Harper government, where Prime Minister Harper sent very clear messages to Vladimir Putin about how he had to get out or there would be consequences. The consequences of those began with the Harper government imposing these sanctions that have impacted the economy in Russia. And to give the government credit, they've brought in a lot of very good sanctions as part of this. Targeting the oligarchs is there, and it's important, although they have obviously the capacity to move their money. But targeting very precise industries, which the government has done, all necessary, technology industries, defense industries, these are all necessary. But I know I got pushed back a bit by government members a meeting or 2 ago, but, you know, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. So the leaky sanctions that I speak of are the sanctions around the issue of snow crabs. And we are not trading snow crabs with Russia because that's part of what we do as Canadians. But as a result of that, though, most of our snow crabs were sold to Japan anyway. So we were doing pretty good. But Japan has now broken all those contracts and is buying all their snow crab from Russia, providing the Putin war machine with direct cash. Here's a G7 partner that has filled in our sanctions where we left out. Now, I wouldn't exactly call snow crab, with all due deference to the fishermen who fish snow crabs in Newfoundland, it's not an essential food. And those things, food is exempted from the sanctions. I understand that. But luxury foods, such as that, or higher priced foods, to me, are things that this committee should study. Why is it that the sanctions that we've imposed on food just say you can trade any food you want with Russia, even though they've had an illegal invasion of Ukraine? Why isn't this committee looking into that as part of the food security issue and the effectiveness of our sanctions? I suspect there are things that we and other Western countries are trading, even in food, that members of this committee wouldn't consider essential. I don't know the last time members around this table ate snow crab. I hope they're eating a lot of lobster. I hope they're eating a lot of lobster because that's the #1 industry in my riding. But we know that lobster is not being shipped, as far as I know, to Russia. So why is it that the committee is unwilling to take a look at those issues and add a fourth or a fifth or a sixth study? Why don't we create another study? I could easily move a motion suggesting we do a separate study on sanctions in the Ukraine, and we could have a great debate for that over the next little while about whether or not that's a subset of the existing study or whether it's an entirely new study, much in the same way Dr. Fry's motion, at least part of it, can be dealt with in the existing study if the committee chooses to do so. So I would ask that the committee continue to move and look at completing the study on Ukraine. The Ukraine, as we know, as I've said, it's changing weekly, almost daily in terms of what's happening. And I would ask that the committee continue to make that the priority when considering its future agenda, and that the implications of that on what happens in Taiwan is important. And I would also venture to say that the committee and the subcommittee on the agenda should consider all of the issues that are on its work plan. Dr. Fry has given her notice of motion. It can be considered as a notice of motion in the work plan without having to actually have a vote here. And the subcommittee can take a look at that with all the other elements that are on the agenda for potential study. So I'm still haven't heard an argument yet from government members, from the members of their coalition partner, the NDP, or from my friends in the bloc as to why it is that the normal committee process of trying to, once a notice of motion is gone, that can be something that the subcommittee on agenda considers at any given time. Why it's just not considered over there, why there is a need for the government to push this through. It speaks to me of what I think is perhaps priorities that aren't in line with what most Canadians think are the issues of the day when it comes to foreign policy that the committee should be spending its time on and hearing witnesses on. So I would offer up that perhaps there are other motivations behind this motion that only the government can answer as to why it is that they want to all of a sudden study this issue rather than a war in Ukraine, and provide the government with the advice of all kinds of analysts, of all kinds of academics, of all kinds of Ukrainians who are experiencing this issue directly themselves, of the business community and whether or not they believe the sanctions are effective, of the banking community as to how those sanctions could be made less leaky, of the industries that are impacted and whether or not they can find other markets, or whether or not they feel, frankly, at unfair competition because they have lost the market and we have allowed other countries, businesses, to go and fill in those markets. It's always hard to get a market back once you lose it. And because the government hasn't chosen to use multilateral organizations, which is Canada's tradition, is to use and work through multilateral organizations like the Francophonie, like the Commonwealth, like the OAS, to get global, ASEAN as well, and the Asian countries. Why is it that I've never heard the foreign minister or the prime minister? The prime minister was just at a meeting of the Americas, and I did not hear the prime minister propose that the Western Hemisphere impose Western Hemisphere sanctions on Russia, and that they come in lockstep with us and the United States on imposing these issues. Why is it that the prime minister, once he left the country, didn't seem to think that the issues of Ukrainian Canadians, the issues that Vladimir Zelensky has raised about it's a good start on sanctions, why it is that he didn't use his pulpit there in his bilateral meetings. Every time you go to a multilateral meeting, the prime minister and the foreign minister, they have a lot of bilateral meetings on the side with their counterparts, why it is that they didn't make a public statement saying that we want the Western Hemisphere to stop trading with Russia. But they didn't do that. So I think the government needs to come forward. I would venture the Minister of Foreign Affairs needs to explain to this committee why it is that the minister is not putting forward in the multilateral organizations probably what I would think today is our most important foreign policy issue to discuss, why they are not taking that traditional Canadian role. That's all points to the sub-amendment issue about why we need to complete this study. There's a lot of work to do here still, and there's a lot of accountability here to do still for the government, who I think has done a fairly timid job at putting pressure on Putin and his advisors and the Russian government, and frankly the Russian people, to put pressure on their own government that this is an unjust war and that they've been fed basically a propaganda set of lies. And the only way that that's going to happen, ultimately, given what's happened to the media and the fact that the world media has been thrown out of Russia, the only way that's going to happen is through, in my view, putting a little more financial pressure and access to other day-to-day goods on the Russian people beyond what they see. Quite frankly, they're not seeing the impacts when a Russian oligarch can come in and basically take over the Starbucks chain or take over the real estate where McDonald's was and do their knockoff burgers and knockoff coffee. The Russian people aren't feeling the same sort of pressure, and therefore aren't putting any pressure on their government. Why isn't this committee looking at the reasons why that happened? So, and why we haven't gone on in the international forum to propose resolutions. The government is willing to propose resolutions here at committee on various issues unrelated to Ukraine, but is not willing to propose motions in the multilateral organizations to try and increase the effectiveness of the effort, the global effort, to reduce the economic viability of the wealth of the oligarchs and the access to Western goods that Russia so clearly loves. The government isn't doing that. The government didn't propose it, and I would love to hear from the government members why it hasn't proposed doing that in any of those multilateral organizations. Why even the basic sanctions that we have now on the 344 people, the oligarchs, and on the limited targeted industries that the government's chosen, why it hasn't promoted those same rules being put in place around the world. I've sat in those meetings. I've sat in the Organization of American States meetings where we put forward those. It took a lot of work, a lot of bilaterals. I experienced the fact that leaky sanctions cause others to fill in. I've been in bilaterals with European countries of the day when we were dealing with Haiti that said, well, you know, there's no UN sanctions, so I can't impose sanctions. But they can impose sanctions if they're regional organization, their regional multilateral organization imposes sanctions. And those organizations, the Francophonie, the OAS, because we've heard from officials in the Ukrainian government.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Maybe a point of interruption to give the speaker a break too, because he needs a drink of water. I am wondering whether the member is actually suggesting that we all of the sanctions, the incredible, really record-breaking number of sanctions that we have imposed against Russia since their illegal invasion of Ukraine, are tabled in Parliament and then referred to this committee. They come as an order of reference to this committee. We are able to study any and all of them at any time, and I'm wondering whether he is actually inferring whether or not he's requesting that this committee should be taking a look at those referrals, because we have not done that. And I might take this opportunity in my moment of interruption to also just tell the committee members that I have two guests with me today. They are interns from the Embassy of the Kingdom of Denmark, 2 graduate students who are learning about Parliament as they shadow me today, and they're having a good lesson. So that's the member might want to respond to my point of order whether or not he is actually asking for us to deal with those references which come from the House.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Allow me to welcome our teams here. Welcome to the committee. Now we revert back to Mr. Perkins.
It always confuses me when I press the button, and then I think somebody on technology is confusing the button, and I put it off and on. But thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Oliphant. I did appreciate the chance to have a sip of a glass of water, and that's an interesting idea. That wasn't exactly what I was proposing, but what I was proposing was looking at the inability or the lack of certain countries that we work with in multilateral organizations, that their lack of implementation of those critical sanctions that Canada has. I think these sanctions should be expanded, but certainly if the subcommittee on agenda, which is I assume where such a thing would go, Mr. Oliphant wanted to look at that, that would be of value, but I don't think it's necessary in the context of something separate because we already have an ongoing study on Ukraine where those things could be presumably incorporated by the committee into that study, and the witnesses could incorporate a discussion on that. I think it would make a very interesting part is to analyze that as part of it, both the effectiveness of the existing sanctions, whether or not those sanctions should be broadened to include other areas that they aren't included now for Canada, such as I said, some of the things like what some might consider more luxury foods that perhaps are not things that Russia needs to survive day to day in terms of food stuff. I personally, coming from the South Shore of Nova Scotia, believe that lobster is a critical day-to-day food stuff, but I'm not sure everybody else would agree with me. But I certainly do. And but at the end of the day, what we're missing, I think, for the effectiveness of the sanctions is that broader question, Mr. Oliphant, about why are other countries not coming to the table the same way as Canada, and what should Canada be doing in pushing forward an agenda that gets more effectiveness to those existing sanctions by bringing in our partners from around the world, having meetings and going and having meetings with the Western Hemisphere in the recent meeting in California without actually coming forward with pressure on those allies to actually be part of our team, to be part of the team that is opposing these sanctions. If anybody knows the effect of imperialism, it's countries in Central and Latin America. And I would think more than most, those countries would be more sensitive to what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and want to be partners in what we're doing than perhaps even other countries around the world. They're very sensitive into the OAS. In 1991, they passed a declaration at the OAS declaring for the first time, when 34 of the 35 countries were for the first time democratic, and we first joined, a sort of NATO type of solution, which is that any failing of democracy in the Western Hemisphere would be met with immediate action by the Organization of American States. That was a revolutionary thing, because you have to remember that meeting was held in Chile, in Santiago, and I was at that meeting. And Augusto Pinochet had only given up the presidency in the last year, but was still heading the army in Chile when that declaration happened. So it was quite remarkable that declaration would happen. And given that that's the declaration, it's all the more surprising when the Prime Minister gets together with the Western Hemispheric and the Foreign Minister with the Western Hemispheric countries, as he did recently, that he wouldn't be using that important turning point in the OAS as a reason, as a sensitivity barometer for them as to why they need to join with us and not be trading with Russia, not providing financial services to Russia, not be providing them with technology, military or other goods so that they can continue their illegal war machine. This happened at a time when, the U.S. had some history in Central America and Nicaragua and other places. And there is a deep, deep sensitivity in Latin America to any country that interferes in the sovereign borders, sovereign issues of other countries. It's why in the past, although they, for the most part, have gotten together multiple times since then in the Western Hemisphere, why in the past they were initially reluctant to impose sanctions because they saw that as interference. Mexico and other countries saw that as interference with the domestic politics of a country, but I think most of the Western Hemisphere has grown since then in terms of joining the global nations in their view that if you're going to protect democracy, you have to protect it with the use of all the tools you have, and some of the most effective tools, as we saw in South Africa, Haiti, and in fact, the government of Canada currently has 21 countries that it has economic sanctions with, some going back to the 1990s, Indonesia, Myanmar, and others. Another great area for this committee to study at some point is why is it that we have sanctions?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Madame Bendayan.
I simply cannot listen to this anymore. It is disgraceful how irrelevant this member is when speaking about a sub-amendment on a motion to study women's reproductive rights. I cannot believe that this committee is entertaining the willful discussion by this man of what he thinks to be important future studies for our committee. Not only is he not a member of this committee, but his discussion about previous attendance at conferences in Latin America is so besides the point that I would ask the chair to rule on relevance immediately. Thank you.
If I could speak to that point of order before you rule.
Yes, Mr. Perkins.
One, I think for the member to make any personal judgments about me or my reasoning for talking about why the completion of these studies is more important, I think is abhorrent that she would cast aspersions on me personally, and I would like her to apologize for that. And secondly, she used the term "this man." If I were to do that to the opposite gender, of course, I would be vilified in public opinion. And it's another example of liberal double standard where a government member thinks they can bully the opposition into shutting up at this committee.
Debate. Is this debate?
Well, it seemed like the point of order was
Well, no,
made.
but the honourable member
Are
is
you chairing the
debating a
committee? Does
point
she
of
have the
order.
floor? Does a member from
No,
Vancouver
point of
Centre have the
order,
floor, or
Mitch.
do I?
Point of order, Chair.
Dr. Fry, yes?
Sorry, this is so irrelevant. This is so personal.
That's not a point of order. Point of order.
No, but this person
not a point of order,
is
Mr. Chair.
speaking off the topic. I think if the honourable member would let me finish my sentence, we have listened to him now for so long that he might be respectful enough to listen to me speak. Chair, this is irrelevant. I think, as Madam Bendayan has said, it is repetitive. It is talking about Haiti. It's talking about the Organization of American States. It's talking about everything but the sub-amendment. It is repetitive and irrelevant. Thank you. That's my point of order.
Mr. Speaker, on this point of order.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. We now go to Madam Goodridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On this point of order, I do believe that we are starting to get into the realm, just on the points of order being very disrespectful. I do understand that Mr. Perkins has spoke at length on some topics. I've learned quite a bit about Canada's history on sanctions, but I do not believe that the original points of order are necessarily called for, and I do think that it is incumbent on each and every one of us members to treat each other with respect. And I don't believe that I was hearing that as we were going on. And so I would just argue that this is not, in fact, a point of order. Thank you.
On this point of order,
Thank-
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Goodridge. Mr. Janice?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do, just with respect to the original point of order, also just want to say that there's no hierarchy of speakers, and we have associate members who follow the work of this committee, and to diminish someone's contribution because they're an associate member as opposed to a member that's not an associate member, I think I wonder if we can maybe get clarity from the clerk or the chair that that anybody who's subbed in and speaking has the full rights of making arguments, and it's not germane to how their point is understood, whether or not they're a regular member or an associate member. And the other issue, just with respect to what the content of the sub-amendment is, the content of the sub-amendment deals with the question of completion of studies versus not completion of studies. So surely it's very much on the point of completion of studies or not, the nature of those studies that would or would not be completed, and this is the core subject matter. So it's obvious that it needs to be part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Janice. I would just remind you that Mr. Perkins has not been subbed in. However, insofar as Section 119 is concerned, he does have the right to have the floor. Ms. Bendayan, did you have a point of order?
Mr. Chair, I would ask for a ruling on relevance. I can speak at length to the number of items that were completely irrelevant, but I think you heard very well the member opposite, and would ask for a ruling, please.
Thank you, Ms. Bendayan. Now, first of all, allow me to remind every member of this committee that it is imperative that we remain civil and we allow every member to have their say, so to speak. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, it is important the members speak to the relevant issues at hand, that they do not engage in repetition. I think the member would concede that on point of order, one of the other members of this committee said it's been fabulous because they've received a history on sanctions. A history on sanctions, Mr. Perkins, is not relevant to the sub-amendment at hand. So I would ask for the last time that you do please keep your focus on the sub-amendment, ensure that the points that you are raising are relevant and that they are not repetitive. Thank you, Mr. Perkins. The floor is yours.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Do I have the
Yes,
floor?
Mr. Moretz.
I believe that if you seek it, you will find agreement for a suspension of this committee until 10 minutes to the hour.
Is there a unanimous consent? There's unanimous consent for 5 minutes. Is that good?
Yeah.
Thank you. Suspended for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
resume debate.
Mr. Chair, I'll conclude my remarks there.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. So next we go to Mr. Jennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but I will strike for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Jennis. We next go to Mr. Zuberi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll also remove myself from the speaking list.
Mr. Viersen is not here. We next go to Madam Goodridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will also remove my name from the speaking list at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Goodridge. We next go to Madame Michaud.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to also remove myself from the list of speakers.
So now, as I understand, as I understand it, there is a compromise sub-amendment that has been. No.
Mr. Chair, as I understand, if I may.
Yes, absolutely. So, given that there's no longer debate about the sub-amendment, is there unanimous consent? No. So we will have to. I'm sorry.
No unanimous consent. We'll do the votes. We'll vote on
Absolutely.
the sub-amendment now.
Madam Clerk, if we could put it to a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the sub-amendment of Monsieur Bergeron. Ms. Bendayan.
Oui, en faveur.
Dr. Fry.
Sorry, I'm muted. I'm sorry, Chair. I did not, Clerk, I did not hear the question.
My apologies, Dr. Fry. The vote is on the sub-amendment of Monsieur Bergeron.
Okay.
So debate has concluded. We're reverting back to Mr. Bergeron's sub-amendment.
Sorry, Chair. I did not realize we had ended our suspension. So I'm still trying to catch up here. All right.
Would you like?
Yes.
Me? Thank
yes.
you.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Mr. Sarai.
Yes.
Mr. Zuberi.
Yes.
Mr. Abou-Taif.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
Yes.
Mr. Jennis.
Yes.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes.
Madame Michaud. And Mr. Chair, Ms. McPherson.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, that is 11 in favor.
Thank you very much. So now we go to the amendment, as I understand.
Yes.
Is there unanimous consent to accept the amendment? Nope. Madam Clerk, if we could call a voice vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the amendment as amended. Ms. Bendayan.
Non, je vote contre.
Dr. Fry.
Nope.
Mr. Oliphant.
No.
Mr. Sarai.
No.
Mr. Zuberi.
No.
Mr. Abou-Taif.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
Yes.
Mr. Jennis.
Sorry. Yes.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes.
Madame Michaud.
En faveur.
Ms. McPherson.
No.
Mr. Chair, that is 6 nays and 5 yeas.
Thank you. So the sub-amendment is defeated. The amendment, my apologies, the amendment is defeated. So we now go to the motion.
And I would have an amendment to the motion. I would like to add the words, and that this study does not begin prior to October 1st, 2022.
Is there unanimous consent to that? Yes, Mr. Jennis?
Just to very briefly speak to the amendment, we have had throughout the debate members of the government professing that although they didn't want the amendment to the motion, professing that this study would not proceed until the previous work was complete. And those statements are on the record, so I hope we will be able to hold the government to those statements that they've made. The October 1st date does not mean it would begin right away after that. Obviously, we do have important work to complete on other fronts, but I do think this is a good amendment. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Genis. Do we have unanimous consent? Excellent. Well, the meeting stands.
Vote on the main motion.
What's that?
To vote on the main motion as amended.
Wait on the moment as amendment. Unanimous consent.
On the amendment.
On the amendment. Okay, but we were on the motion. Okay, but yes, is there unanimous consent for adoption?
I would like
the
no, I would like a vote, please.
You would like a vote? Madam Clerk, if we could call a vote.
Mr. Chair, just to clarify, we're on the motion as amended, correct? We're voting on the motion as amended.
Motion as amended.
Okay,
correct.
thank you.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the motion as amended. Ms. Bendayan.
Oui.
Dr. Fry.
Yes?
Mr. Oliphant. Yes. Mr. Sarai.
Yes.
Mr. Zuberi.
Yes.
Mr. Abel Taif.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
Yes.
Mr. Genis.
No.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes.
Madame Michaud.
En faveur.
Ms. McPherson.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, that is 10 yeas and 1 nay.
Thank you. So the amended motion is adopted. Now, that's just in the nick of time. So the meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.